shine in a crowd, we never hesitate. Let us rise to the clouds. We got nothing to lose, I know the time is right. Let us light up the fuse. And I know, and I know, and I know, and I know we're perfect, you and I. And I don't, and I don't, and I don't, and I don't giving up without a fight. What I feel, I know it's right. Let us detonate tonight. Let us detonate tonight. Let us detonate tonight. We can shine in a crowd, we never hesitate. Let us rise to the clouds. We got nothing to lose, I know the time is right. Let us light up the fuse. And I know, and I know, and I know, and I know we're perfect.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Just right. So starting off, Lapisulia, thank you for reminding me how bad I am at XCOM. That was a glorious, epic failure of a night that I'm sure that no one's going to let me forget, like, ever. It was good. For those who didn't catch that, last week I decided to play some XCOM 2 Long War 2. And I've beaten the game a couple times now, one of which was on the hardest difficulty. I managed to squeeze that through. I plug in Long War 2 on just regular difficulty, not the easiest but not the hardest, and I wipe twice. And then I think midway through the third time, I actually lowered the difficulty and still wiped. I'm not sure if that actually changed it though, so that may have done nothing. Whatever the case is, I royally embarrassed myself as a gaming strategist, and I love the strategy of video games. And I got my ass kicked by a strategy game. Normally my wheelhouse. In any case, so that was a fun bit of embarrassment. And then there was also the point at which someone pointed out to me that on a lot of these Mortiel fallacies, I apparently start yawning towards the last third. Well, it's something I've noticed, I'm keenly aware of, but someone pointed out what I'm doing that's causing it. Apparently, I don't breathe well while I'm talking. I just get so ranty, I stop breathing well, and then that causes me to yawn. It may seem like common knowledge to a lot of people, but it's something that I never thought of. I just rant and I start yawning, and I'm like, man, I must be just tiring myself out. So in any case, I'm going to try to breathe better. It's something, because I do have a little bit of blonde in my hair, right? It's something I do forget to do at times. I have to actually have notes in my hand. Breathe in, breathe out. Okay, I got it. Anyway, old blonde jokes aside. So tonight, actually, I'm adding a bit of levity to what is otherwise going to be a not very pleasant conversation in general, because tonight we're going to be talking about the pleasantness that is one of the oldest, I say the oldest, but obviously it may not be the oldest myth in video games, and that, of course, is violence. Maximum violence. it's actually leading back to a lot of recent myths that have re-emerged, and we're gonna dissect the silliness that is controversy. Now, to frame this and to be clear in what I'm talking about here, what is motivating this was a real life tragedy. That was the school shooting that happened in Florida, and in no way am I attempting to make light of that or to even discuss that for that matter, because there are plenty of other voices out there that are discussing a myriad of topics around the topics that are affecting that. I'm focusing solely on video games and some of the comments that came as a result of that event, and it's something that pops its ugly head up from time to time, and I feel like that a lot of people need to do their best to squash this whenever possible, because it is something that could have negative repercussions if people just ignore these claims. So with that said, we're going to go on to our first story on here, our first bit here, and we're going to read this guy in his entirety. As a small note here, I'm not going to even start with you guys on how much of a pain in the ass it was to strip out all of the bullshit off of CNN's website. Yes, this is CNN.com. This is what CNN.com looks like when you strip away all of the bullshit nonsense that they have on there. All of the outbrain ads, the title bars, the "would you like to know more about this story that has nothing to do with the story you're reading?" So I stripped out all of that because I want just the story. CNN, seriously, you're like a seizure of a website. Anyway, so this story that was published on February 22nd, so a few weeks back, and it was in more recent after the school shooting happened. But in any case here, let's get into it. And this is again from CNN. President Donald Trump said Thursday during a White House meeting on school safety that the nation needs to address that God, this is already starting off well. Needs to address what young people are seeing. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence in video games is really shaping these young people's thoughts. And you go a step further, and that's the movies. You see these movies, they're so violent, and yet a kid is able to see that movie if sex isn't involved. Killing, though, is involved, he said. Now, as a small anecdote on here, I've actually made the joke quite frequently. I wish, do I have that? Can I quickly bring up my little saved meme on here? If I've got it quick enough here on hand. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time searching for it, but one of the few memes that I actually made myself, because strangely I couldn't find it. You think, there we go. So let's see if this actually shows up correctly. Find out. Nope. No, it's not going to show up right. Probably because I've got everything discombobulated. Actually, don't even know where it showed up to. But in any case, I have a meme of the Joker meme of, showing the Joker saying, "Someone shoot someone in the face and no one bats an eye." Get it? Bats. Ha ha ha. Show a nipple and everyone loses their mind. And it was kind of something I joked about frequently, because it is really kind of this strange bit of United States culture that violence is perfectly acceptable in United States media. However, any hint of sexuality is oftentimes seen as taboo, which is a lot of times why you see kind of sexuality used as a means of kind of enticement or kind of like sensationalism, if you will. Because, well, when they say sex sells, that's not actually true. They've shown studies that say that sex doesn't necessarily sell. Depends on your product. That study said that, oh, it never does, but obviously there's some products that sex does sell. Selling lingerie, yeah, sex sells. But in any case, the point is that Kev is a scrub and a console fanboy. In any case, the thing is that when you're talking about the media and how the media treats sex versus violence, yeah, it's pretty heavily, like, in general, violence is considered okay, sex is not, and it's a really strange thing. I don't know why in the United States everybody is so freaking ashamed of anything sexuality. It's perfectly normal, perfectly natural, but it's in the puritanical kind of practice that's been ingrained into American culture since the very beginning of, you know, especially women should be, you know, freaking covered from their chin to their ankles, and showing nothing at all, and you know, heaven forbid. And here's the strange where that dichotomy comes on there is in movies where they do show nudity. One thing you'll notice is that the order in which nudity gets shown, or what people consider to be nudity, is women's breasts, and then women's genitals, and then the farthest most obscure one that you rarely see is male genitals. It's really odd. Like, you don't see it that often, to the point where it's like, whoa, hey, there's a guy's penis. Really weird that that's so, like, I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting off on the topic here already. In any case, so yes, that is true. It is interesting that that sex is treated more heavily than violence. Really, in actuality, they both should be treated the same. If you're gonna allow a kid to see violent stuff, well, who cares? Anyway, his remarks were dismissed by Chris Grady, a survivor of the February 14th shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. I grew up playing video games, first-person shooter games, and I would never, ever dream of taking the lives of any of my peers. In Munich, Germany, and here's where we get the kind of sensationalism, they put a quote from a kid that was a victim of the school shooting, and in the next paragraph, oh, there's an 18-year-old gunman, a one person, you know, who killed 9 people on July 2016, who was a fan of first-person shooter video games, according to reports. This detail led to many to worry that violent video games may negatively affect their own children. But what's the truth? This is where we're going to get into comedy really quick. Both the American Psychological Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics take a firm stance against children and teens playing violent video games. A psychological report shows that more than 90% of the children in the United States play video games. Among children ages 12 to 17, that number rises to 97%. More importantly, 85% of the video games on the market contain some form of violence. And I love their sensationalist titles on here. They say it all: Manhunt, Thrill Kill, Gears of War, Mortal Kombat. Yes, of course, these are the most popular games circa, what, early 2000s? Like, I'm curious as to at what point these people actually have looked at any modern video games. In any case, here's the thing, and however, even seemingly benign Pokemon Go requires players to go to battle. Let's take a look at this real quick here. 97% of children between ages 12 and 17 play video games. 85% of the video games out there, vast majority, are violent in some fashion. Ergo, the statistics are extremely high that children between the ages of 12 and 17 are going to be playing violent video games. Thousands upon thousands, millions even, children are playing violent video games every day. Millions of them. How many of them are shooting up schools? Maybe a dozen. That seems like that's a pretty, even as there's been increasing levels of school shootings, and it's tragic to be sure, even as we're seeing increasing levels of these tragic incidents happening, they're still so small. It's not even 1%. That's not even a fraction of a percent. That's such an infinitesimal number in the statistics of how many children play violent video games versus how many children perpetrate violent crimes. It's such an infinitesimal number, and it could be called coincidental at best. Causation does not equal correlation. Any person with basic logic will say that. Oh, they did something violent and played violent video games does not mean ergo violent video games cause that. We're going to touch on that more here as we go on. The American Psychological Association observed in an August 2015 policy statement that research demonstrated a link between violent video games used for both an increase in aggressive behavior and a decrease in pro-social behavior, empathy, and moral engagement. Now, anybody who's played Overwatch or League of Legends or Dota 2 obviously can tell that not just children, but people of all ages tend to have a decrease in pro-social behavior, empathy, and moral engagement when they're playing the games. Literally, I mean, if you've ever played League of Legends, you pretty much think that humanity is dead. It's bad. But the thing is that people are toxic when they're in the game, and then they stop playing the game, and then they go about their time. They're not generally toxic in real life. They have this ability to separate the fictional world, the fictional environment of that video game with the reality of the world around them. It's kind of strange that people with normal mental health have that capability. In any case, in its July 2016 guideline on media violence, the American Academy of Pediatrics warned that violent media sets a poor example for kids. Video games, the Academy noted, should not use human or other living targets or award points for killing, because this teaches children to associate pleasure and success with their ability to cause pain and suffering of others. To combat this point, know that trains them to have a reward response for being able to perform well at a video game. They don't often associate a avatar on screen with an actual other person. Their reward is not the suffering of another. Their reward is winning a competition against another person. That would be the same logic as saying, well, baseball, I'm hitting a baseball at somebody, right? So therefore, if I get a home run, I'm hitting the baseball harder and being more violent towards that baseball. Ergo, hitting a home run encourages me to be more violent. That makes no sense. Same with if you're talking soccer or if you're talking, NFL football, whatever. They're all combative sports. They're all almost a psychological replacement for the survival of the fittest instinct, if you will. That's my opinion. I don't necessarily think that's got any basis behind it per se, but they are combative sports nonetheless. Scroll down here. Overall, the Academy's summary of the results of more than 400 studies reveal a significant link between being exposed to violent media in general and aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, and angry feelings. The problem is that they, of course, don't link any of those on there. The 400 studies are also conflicting. The body of work on violence in video games is actually conflicted. Like, there is studies that have shown that there's links, there are studies that have shown there's no link. The problem is, though, is that a lot of the studies that have shown links, later the methodology was questioned as tilting the study into a certain bias by essentially leaning the subjects in certain ways, and we'll kind of talk about that here. Whitney DeCamp, an associate professor of sociology at Western Michigan University, says the evidence points to either no relationship between playing video games and ultra-violent behavior, or insignificant link between the two. Sure, he says, some studies have revealed that the connection between kids playing video games and violent behavior, but there's a problem when looking at these two things in a vacuum. Kids who like to play brutal video games may have a predisposition towards aggression, he said. Here's the other thing. Some people are violent and play video games. Again, this comes back to the correlation does not equal causation. Just because a dog is in a room with a dead body does not mean the dog killed the whatever was the dead body, right? It's the two exist at the same time. It doesn't mean that one led to the other. And there's actually been cases in science in the past that have been overturned because they saw two things existing side by side and then thought that they led to one another, but actually ended up finding out that they actually just existed side by side. And that's the thing, is that any good scientist would tell you that no science is definitive, right? It's always something that can be changed later on, and that's something that is also happening here more often. Sure, he says, oh wait, did I read that? Yeah. The real question, he said, is does playing violent video games cause a person to act violently? In his own study, he examined that question using data from a 2008 Delaware school survey, which included responses from 6,500 8th graders. Among the questions, the students were asked whether they had played violent video games in the past year. DeCamp factored out the propensity to play violent video games due to a natural attraction to brutality, along with other factors such as gender and family relation. He discovered that playing video games, no matter how bloody, did not predict violent behavior. Christopher Ferguson, an associate professor and co-chairman of the Department of Psychology at Stenson University, supports this view. In fact, he goes so far as to suggest that violent video games may help reduce societal violence rather than increase it. Basically, by keeping young males busy with things they like, and this would include anything from playing sports and collecting stamps to playing first-person shooter video games, you keep them off the streets and out of trouble. Now, this is true, sort of, and I can see where he's essentially saying probably more like, I would say, lower income families where and especially in urban environments where the children are highly likely to end up involved in gang activity. Yes, absolutely, then playing video games can help keep them off the streets and out of trouble. However, I would say that people, regardless of gender, I think that a lot of times that there's a certain amount of catharsis that comes with playing video games. Being able to say, everybody has a moment where somebody cuts them off in traffic and they're upset about that, or they don't get something they want, like they didn't get the promotion they wanted at work, or whatever, something negative happens to them. A lot of people nowadays are taught to internalize that, not to express that emotion, not to let it out is considered socially inappropriate to vent your frustration out in public. So you bottle it up, you take it home with you, and oftentimes, that would lead to kind of just general unhealthiness. I mean, it doesn't necessarily make a person violent, and that's kind of the point here. It doesn't make a person violent, but the point is that they may in some other way be mentally unhealthy just because they're not really expressing themselves. Video games, however, allow them that release, including, as sad as it is for me to admit, being toxic. Those people that are really bitter at you, and I'll be the first to admit that's me. I get really toxic in PvP games, most particularly. It's probably because I'm just frustrated about other stuff, and therefore I take it out on everything else, right? And honestly, it's a certain amount of catharsis. You get done with that, and you're like, I feel more relaxed. And you could talk to almost any serious gamer out there, it's a relaxation, it's a release, it's an escape. They're playing video games to escape from their current reality, not for training on how to react to their current reality, right? It's not a reflection of their current reality, they're trying to get away from it. And that's very often the case for a lot of people, is that it gives them that moment of respite. It's like taking a vacation, only you don't have to pay for a cruise. Anyway, he added with that newer studies with better methods have typically failed to find much evidence of a connection between brutal games and even more aggressive acts, let alone violence. Persuasive evidence comes from an economic study published in February 2016, which looked at violent criminal offenses in the weeks after the release of a popular video games. Tracked both sales and crime rates, the authors discovered general societal violence decrease in the weeks after appearance of a new edition. Okay, I actually didn't read that part before. I was skimming through the article. I missed that one. New Call of Duty release. All the gangbangers put down their guns for a couple weeks and go shoot each other in game. That's the image I'm getting. I'm like, what? I'm not sure. That seems like a very loose correlation. By the way, that's the reason why I'm laughing. It doesn't seem like something that I think there's a. I feel like that's way too loose. That's too loose. Of like, oh, a new video game gets released and all of a sudden violence decreases. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong there. But in any case, obviously this does not rule out longer term effects. Already I'm not breathing right. I'm having just issues breathing while I'm talking. I don't know what it is. Anyway, still they make a bid for games offering cathartic effects, allowing other players to safely release their aggression. Yes. While the debate rages on, Ferguson believes the tide has turned against linking video games to violence. Yes, because it's a fucking scapegoat. Yeah. There's more skepticism these days, he said, and a group of 238 scholars asked the American Psychological Association to retire its outdated and problematic statement on video game violence. See, the thing is that, and I've made this joke before, or not joke, but I've made this comment before, that a lot of the shit's a scapegoat, and we'll talk about that more at the end when I'm kind of ranting on my opinions here. When asked about the teen shooter in Munich, DeCamp said, "We need to take a lot of caution before we place blame on any one particular thing." Meanwhile, Ferguson noted that almost all young males play violent video games, and yet the vast majority, like 99.99999%, are not committing crimes. Both the Psychological Association and the American Academy for Pediatrics suggest that parents take an active interest in and monitor the games played by their children. This is simple but a bit of practical advice, and not an all-out prohibition. May be the best solution. Now that I can agree with. I actually am all for parents being more active in their children's lives, because I do feel like that there is a kind of a instinct, right, to use video games as a parenting, like as a substitute parent, as a babysitter, if you will. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a parent give the kid the iPad just to shut them up, and so that they can do whatever they want. It's like, or you could play with your kids, you know, like if you want to play on the iPad, sit there with the iPad and play the iPad games with your kids, rather than just letting them do their own thing. I don't know. It's like I'm weird about that, and that's obviously my opinion on there. That's not backed by any evidence or anything. I just, in my opinion, I'm more about being actively engaged with parents, or as a parent, being actively engaged with your kid. You know, first of all, they're only going to be kid once. All before you know it, they're going to be an adult, and you're going to be like, the hell happened all the time. And you're going to regret the fact that you didn't spend more time with them as they go off on their own. And they're married and they're doing their own thing and you don't see them very much. Man, life goes fast. So every moment you stick that iPad in your kid's hand, that's a moment that you don't get to spend with your kid, you know. Even if they want to play that game on the iPad, play it with them. Find something that's kind of more cooperative or two-player or something like that, where you and your kid can share an experience together. That's what I would say. That's where I like a lot of games like Wii games or that sort of thing. Something that you can do with your kid is going to be, to me, something I feel like is a better solution. And, you know, I understand a lot of parents are not going to be so heavily involved in like newer games like your even your Call of Duties or something like that. They're not going to be heavily involved in those, and I understand. And kids are going to want to play whatever their friends are playing, and that may not be what the parents like. But you still should find some common ground. You should at least try to figure out why they like it, what interest they have in it, and be involved with them in general. Even if you don't like Call of Duty, you can't stand, but your kid really wants to play it, you know, find out what he likes about it. You know, like, let him talk your ear off, because I guarantee you, kids will nerd the fuck out about, you know, they just got this and this stuff, and it may sound like Greek to you, but at least try to be interested in it, you know. And that I feel like that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a link between video games and violent behavior at all. I think that more has to do with that may be a contributor, not a cause, but a contributor to violent behavior in children, is when they're really disassociated, like they're not disassociated, what's the right term? They're kind of more distant from their parents. Their parents want to shove an iPad in their hands instead of, you know, talking to them and treating them like a person. They can kind of develop that distance, and that could potentially isolate them and lead to more troubling behavior. Again, this is me with very rudimentary logic coming to that conclusion. No evidence basing that there, so big heaping pile of salt with that. Now, with all that said, one of the more recent studies published on video game violence and violent behavior, it was actually posted, I believe this was posted in January of 2018, if I remember correctly. Hold on. When was this posted? January 16th, 2018 is when this was published. This is by Dana Yorko here. Researchers at the University of York have found no evidence to support the theory that video games make players more violent. In a series of experiments with more than 3,000 participants, the team demonstrated that video game concepts do not prime players to behave in certain ways that increase the realism of violent video games does not necessarily increase aggression in players. Breathing. The dominant model of learning in games is built on the idea that exposing players to concepts such as violence in a game makes the concepts easier to do in real life. This is known as priming and is thought to lead to changes in behavior. Previous experiments on this effect, however, have provided mixed conclusions. So, just as a side thought before I go on here, when they're talking about priming a lot, this is an idea that is pretty old, and it didn't used to be called priming. It used to be called desensitizing. You may have heard that term before. The thing is that's been around since before really psychiatry was really a big thing, or psychology was a big thing. This goes back to like old early American Puritanism and such, of seeing naked women desensitizes you to the special relationship between you and your wife. And I feel like that the concept of video games priming people to do violent behavior has a lot of the similarities between that line of thinking and the line of thinking, the similar line of religious thinking between watching pornography, for example, desensitizes you to the sexual experiences with your wife or your spouse or whatever, gender neutral there, whatever. that it's a religious thing that's drilled and indoctrinated into people's heads, to kind of encourage them to live a more pure existence and not be sexually what's the word I'm looking for? Whatever, too sexually open. And I do feel like that is something that I do think is kind of very interesting, that the correlation there of essentially you can be desensitized to violence, and that can make you more violent. And if you're desensitized to sexuality, that can make you more sexual. And you're all going to hell. Anyway, researchers at the University of York expanded the number of participants in the experiments compared to studies that had gone before it, and compared different types of gaming realism to explore whether more conclusive evidence could be found. In one study, participants played a game where they had to be either a car avoiding collisions with trucks or a mouse avoiding being caught by a cat. Following the game, the players were shown various images, such as a dog, a bus, or a dog, and asked to label them either as a vehicle or an animal. That's an interesting test. Dr. David Zendel from the university's Department of Computer Science said, "If players are primed through the immersion themselves in the concepts of the games, they should be able to categorize the objects associated with the game more quickly in the real world once the game had concluded." That's an interesting way that they went about it. There was no violence necessarily involved in that. Across the two games, we didn't find this to be the case. Participants who played the car-themed game were no quicker at categorizing vehicle image. Indeed, some cases their reactions were significantly slower. So essentially, to break it down, gosh dang, I don't know, I have to figure out something with my breathing because that's really sucky. But in any case, where it's kind of going is essentially the idea behind it is if they were playing that vehicle dodging trucks, right? Their brains should be kind of more reactive to those trucks, right? So afterwards, they should be quicker at identifying trucks because they've been primed for it. And likewise, if their mouse being avoided by or getting avoided by a cat or whatever, they should be quicker at identifying dogs. Like it should be faster because they've been primed for those interactions. That's kind of interesting. In a separate but connected study, the team investigating whether the realism influenced the aggression of the game players. Researchers in the passage suggested that the greater the realism of the game, the more primed players are by violent concepts, leading to antisocial effects in the real world. Dr. Zendel said there are several experiments looking at the graphic realism in video games, but they have returned with mixed results. There are, however, other ways that violent games can be realistic besides looking like the real world, such as the way characters behave, for example. Our experiment looked at the use of ragdoll physics in game design, which creates characters that move and react in the same way they would in real life. Human characters are modeled on the movements of the human skeleton and how the skeleton would fall if it were injured. The experiment compared players' reaction in two combat games, one that used ragdoll physics to create realistic character behavior and one that did not, in an anime world that nevertheless looked real. Following the game, the players were asked to complete word puzzles called word fragmentation completion tasks, where the researchers expected more violent word associations that would be chosen by those players in the game that employ more realistic behaviors. Essentially, it's more or less like a Rorschach test, only with words. And if you choose certain key violent phrases and mixed with these certain abstract concepts, that means you're more violent. They compared the results of this experiment with another test of game realism, where a single bespoke war game was modified to form two different games. In one of these games, the enemy characters used realistic soldier behaviors, whilst in the other game they did not employ realistic soldier behaviors. Dr. Zendel said, "We found that the priming of violent concepts, as measured by how many violent concepts appeared in the word fragmentation completion task, was not detectable. There was no difference in priming between the game that employed ragdoll physics and the game that didn't, as well as no significance in the difference between the game that used real and unreal soldier tactics. The findings suggest that there is no links between these kinds of realism in games and the effects that video games are commonly thought to have on their players. Further study is now needed into other aspects of realism to see if it has the same result. What happens when we consider the realism of bystanding characters in the game, for example, and the inclusion of extreme content, such as torture? We also only tested these theories on adults, so more work is needed to understand whether this is different on children players." So, again, what this is talking about here is we again have a study that's simple in scope, and this is probably the most recent study done on violent behaviors. And essentially the way they did it is they kind of tried to avoid the reason why they did it in this manner, and it sounds like it's kind of abstract in the way they did it. The reason why they did it that way was because they want to avoid skewing the results of the test. They don't want people to really understand that the game is about video game violence per se. They want them to think that it might be about something else, especially the first test where it's you're a mouse trying to get away from a cat, or you're a car trying to get across traffic or whatever. You wouldn't think that it's violent, but the act of being hunted by another animal or the act of nearly being hit by a vehicle is violent to your brain. You may not think it is, but it is violent. The shooter ones and the ragdoll physics and that sort of thing, that one is interesting because for all intents and purposes, or I should say the interesting / potentially part that doesn't really mesh with me is there was no control, there was no non-violent game test like with ragdoll physics or whatever. It was all like combat. So it's essentially, if you're trying to determine that violent video games did not have an effect on there, you would want a game that's not violent in any way, like Stardew Valley, where you're planting, right? And so you're doing something completely non-violent in any way, shape, or form. And then games where you're doing the ragdoll physics violence versus unrealistic physics violence, and you compare all three side by side, that to me feels like you would get a better example. The reason why is because they're doing these word fragmentation tasks, and if both games are violent, if the two samples you're comparing are both violent, the word fragmentation test showing very similar results doesn't necessarily mean that the ragdoll game, the more realism, was somehow, not there. If you had a third control that was non-violent, you could then draw a distinction that said, hey, this non-violent game shows similar results in the afterwards test. I guess that's where I'm going on there, is that I feel like they kind of, that result wasn't necessarily very conclusive in any way. It's essentially, you just said, hey, we compared apples to this other breed of apples, and they both appear to be apples. That's really what that said to me. It's not, I don't know. Maybe that's just me. But that was also two adults who had fully developed brains. I feel like the problem with any tests that have been done on children is that they, as was mentioned in that article, they're often tested in a vacuum. They don't consider other factors in there. For example, was there any other traumatic events occurring in their life? What is their environment at home? Things like that. There's a lot of other factors what can develop a child's mind to be more violent or be less violent. For example, if you have a sibling, especially a sibling of the same gender as you, because I don't know why that seems to always create more friction amongst younger siblings. At least that's my personal experience. As Zyphon and I joked on the last podcast, the whole video game violence thing, the myth that is in there is that video games make you violent. Well, no, you only are violent while you're playing the game. And Zyphon and I both shared an anecdote about the broken controllers from playing the Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Or, no, I don't think it was the Turbo version. I think it was just Super Street Fighter 2, the one released in somewhere in the mid-90s for Super Nintendo. I don't remember when. Point is that, you know, us in a match against each other, you know, frustrated as hell, we'd be fighting all the time. But here's the thing. This is where doing the study in the vacuum doesn't help. Because while Zyphon and I, when we were kids, we'd be playing those video games that were fighting games, right? Street Fighter, one of the original fighting games, right? We'd be fighting each other in the game, so it's violent, and one person would win, we'd get upset, we would fight with each other, right? Ergo, that violent video game led to violence in real life, right? Except we would fight even if there was no violent video games. You know, we'd be playing with Legos and have to fight over that. We'd be playing some game out in the yard and have to fight over that. The point is, the video games were not a factor in our fighting. The fighting was because we were brothers. And we were fighting constantly because brothers do that. And it's not, we didn't end up being somehow detached adults because we fought as kids. We're not we don't have necessarily a propensity to violence because we fought as kids. Because how many freaking brothers do you know growing up that are violent towards each other and then they grow up as perfectly normal, well-adjusted adults? You know, that seems like pretty natural of a thing to happen. Like, brothers are combative. And they're really close and they love each other a lot, so they will fight a lot. It's just natural. And I feel like that's something that often gets skated over, situations like that. Like, look how violent this kid is playing a video game with his brother. Man, he threw a controller at the wall and broke it. Yes, and we threw other stuff against the wall and broke that when we weren't playing video games. So it's not, that's again, the correlation does not equal causation. Violent video games and violent behaviors being next to each other is a coincidence, and it might be correlated, but it does not mean that violence in video games caused violence elsewhere. Now, let me take a drink here real quick, and then I'll get on to my last little bit, which is going to be the quick rant on this whole situation. Okay, so here's the thing. This is kind of my final thoughts, and this is entirely opinion on this point. There's not facts necessarily in here, but it's observations, if you will. This video game violence thing, especially after a tragic event like that school shooting that happened in Florida, it feels to me like it's a pretty disgusting tactic. And the reason why I say that is because it's using the motivation of a tragic event in order to try to push a political agenda. And that's the part that really bugs me about this, is like that. And for that matter, like I said, it's a scapegoat. Oh, well, what could possibly be the problem with this kid who his mom or both parents, one of the two, had died? I think it was his mom had died not long ago. The kid was probably not in a very good place mentally. You try losing a parent and see how that works for you. You're not going to be in a good place, right? But instead of focusing on the mental health aspect as usual, it's let's look at everything else imaginable and blame video games, where there was clearly other factors that could have been a much more heavy influence on the actions of that caused the tragic event. And it's instead of trying to find the actual cause, they smokescreen. You have one side that tries to push one political agenda and another side that tries to push another political agenda, and it's like, come on, guys. Can we use some logic? Can we actually think reasonably and rationally for once and actually come to a conclusion that actually fixes the problem? Now, my opinion on here, based purely upon my own small pinhole view of the world, which is, you know, I try to be as even keel on everything as I can. I try to, you know, if I notice I'm skewed on a view, I try to be open to an opposing opinion and kind of try to incorporate whenever I'm wrong. A lot of people will tell you that I have no problem admitting that I'm wrong on something, which does happen a lot. But my opinion on this whole situation is a lot of people blame lax regulations on something, or violent video games, or too many tits on TV, or whatever. Insert your scapegoat here. The truth of it is, what I feel like really it boils down to is the current divisive culture that we live in right now, where there is, and this is not something that's new. I will be honest, it's something that probably has existed for as long as society has existed, for thousands of years. Is this, I guess you could say, this kind of like finality to the culture tribalism, right? Or combative tribalism is what I called it. Combative tribalism, where you always have a group that's right, you always have a group that's wrong, you have this good group and you have this evil group, and it creates, to me, it creates this this really toxic culture. And like I said, you've always had it. It's not something that's new. You've always had one group that seeks to demonize another group, to make themselves feel morally superior, or to justify genocide. I mean, we saw this in Rome, ancient Rome. We saw this in Greece. We saw this in Alexander's kingdom. We saw this. The Persians did it. You know, even up to more recent times, like Rwanda. We saw this, you know, freaking Nazi Germany. We've seen this over and over again through history, where one group will find a way to demonize another group for some reason or another, to usually tragic results. And my problem with that is that that's something that we have the capability to change. You do see it on small scales, but usually when you get up on large scales, like, there's always this urge for people to, like, I guess, be combative towards another group. And that's, like I said, it's my opinion. It's not factual in any way. It's just my observation on what I see, is that there's a certain tribalism where people in one in-group will feel like that they need to validate that in-group's existence by making themselves the superior of another group. You know, be it whatever it is. And that's not necessarily racial, that's not gender, not necessarily ethnic. It crosses so many boundaries, you know, and it has, you know, so many different variations and flavors. You know, if you quash one particular version of this, then another one pops up later, right? There's always something in there. And it's always been kind of something it's kind of bugged me. I'm a very rational person, and I always tried to be kind of the mediator, the centrist in everything. And I look at one group of people, extremists, and I think, wow, you guys are fucking morons. And then I look at the opposing extremist groups, and I'm like, well, you guys are just as fucking much morons, you know. And I've had that opinion on a lot of cases, and that's really what I feel like. That kind of environment, I feel like, helps breed a lot of these contentious, you know, societies, where people feel like that the answer to their problem is to go and commit some atrocity. And unfortunately, until people can kind of coexist and disagree respectfully, I feel like that's probably going to continue, and it's very unfortunate. It's very, very sad. And like I said, it's my opinion. There's not anything factual in there, and that's kind of a somber ending to the night. But Yeah, I try to add levity where I can, but frankly, it's not a fun topic, and there's no real right answer except for the fact that rather than news organizations seeking to smear video games and make video games out to be a scapegoat for something that's obviously a much deeper problem that's not so easily solved, I don't know. I've got no good answers on that one, but yeah, loads of fun, guys, loads of fun. Anyway, all the entertainment on there, and then Kev can make jokes about me not gaming, because it is what it is. Let's see if we can break some of the less than pleasant nature of the conversation we've had tonight and find someone at least entertaining to follow on Twitch, because then that'll be good. I mean, we do have Anchor. She is playing some Witcher 3, which is a wonderfully violent video game as well. So we're going to host her. By the way, guys, please don't go and kill anybody because you watched someone playing a a completely fictional character in a medieval fictional fantasy realm based upon medieval Poland, and think that it's somehow, acceptable to commit violent acts and stuff. Right. Anyway, so we're gonna throw a host over to Anchor 654 over here, and I hope that you guys have a good night. I know this was a bit more of a somber topic, but sometimes those type of topics need to be talked about because unfortunately there is misinformation all over the place, and that's kind of what I'm really going after. So in any case, I'm going to go ahead and throw the host over her. I'll be back on Saturday. I don't remember what we're doing Saturday. Are we playing games or are we doing the podcast? I can't remember. One of the two. On a quick note, though, thus far, it does appear that we will be moving the podcast completely to podcast as well as the party to 10 a.m. on Saturdays. So every Saturday you will have some kind of content at 10 a.m. no matter which Saturday it is. There was a little bit of confusion where the podcast was at 9 a.m. and then the party was at 10 a.m. and so you didn't really know what time that you were going to be there. So no matter what, this time everything will always be at 10 a.m. and yeah, so that'll be good fun. Anyway, so stop back on Saturday 10 a.m. We'll have some more streaming goodness then. I don't remember what kind of streaming goodness it is. And then next Monday, I promise I will be back with a proper game stream. Mondays have just been busy and kind of tiring recently, so we'll get back into it. I'll find something to play. Oh, and we'll, I believe this Saturday is not, no, I think this Saturday is not is the podcast. So in any case, though, we'll get some good fun on. This Monday, I'll probably be trying out some Rainbow Six Siege because they have that new zombie update that looks amazing. I can't wait to play that. I'll probably be playing that off stream for a bit too, just so I don't look so scrubby while I'm actually playing it. Good times. All right, we're gonna throw a host over to her. You guys have a good night. We'll catch you guys later. Cheers.